Marissa Collins entered the world on a gray October morning in Knoxville, Tennessee, but the moment she arrived, no one reached for her with joy. Her mother, Sheila Lane, was barely 17 and already worn thin by the consequences of a life lived too fast. Responsibility had never been part of her vocabulary. Stability wasn't something she had ever seen, let alone offered. And the tiny, squirming infant placed on her chest felt less like a miracle and more like a misstep she was desperate to erase. Sheila never knew the father. She never tried to. The months leading up to Marissa's birth were filled with late-night parties, shifting apartments, and a rotating cast of people who drifted in and out of her life without leaving names behind. When the baby arrived, Sheila stared at her with a flat, exhausted expression. The child cried, Sheila sighed. The nurses waited for a flicker of maternal instinct that never came. For the first few years, Marissa lived in an environment no child should ever remember. The small apartment in East Knoxville was cluttered, noisy, and rarely clean. Sheila treated motherhood like a burden she had been tricked into carrying. She fed Marissa out of obligation, not tenderness, scolded her for crying, left her with neighbors when she wanted to disappear for the night. People came and went through the apartment, bringing with them smoke, alcohol, and a kind of heaviness that settled into the walls. It didn't take long for Sheila's own mother, Dorothy Lane, to intervene. Dorothy was a stern, practical woman in her 60s, shaped by a lifetime of working-class survival and an unwavering belief in self-discipline. When she arrived one afternoon and found Marissa sitting on a stained carpet beside an overturned bottle and a drifting television screen, Dorothy made a decision, not out of love, but out of certainty that Sheila would eventually lose custody and the child would be swallowed by the foster care system. Dorothy filed the paperwork herself. Within weeks, Marissa was living in Dorothy's small house on the outskirts of Knoxville. The legal adoption went through without resistance. Sheila signed the documents with almost no emotion, already planning her next move, her next boyfriend, her next escape. In Dorothy's home, Marissa at least had food, clean clothes, and safety. But affection was a luxury Dorothy never offered. She fed the child because it was required, clothed her because it was necessary, and demanded obedience because a girl who grows up wild ends up just like her mother. Love never entered the equation. There were no bedtime stories, no celebrations, no spontaneous hugs. Just rules, chores, schedules, and silence. As Marissa grew older, the emotional gap between them widened. Dorothy believed praise made children soft, so she withheld it. She assumed comfort led to entitlement, so she offered none. The child learned early to stay quiet, to avoid mistakes, to keep her emotions tucked away. When she cried, Dorothy told her to pull herself together. When she asked about her mother, Dorothy shook her head and changed the subject. Then, when Marissa was in middle school, tragedy reshaped the household again. Dorothy's husband, Marissa's adoptive grandfather, died suddenly from a heart attack on his way back from the hardware store. He had been the gentlest presence Marissa had known in that house, a man who smiled at her in passing even if he never said much. His absence left the home colder than ever. Dorothy, hollowed out by grief, she refused to show, hardened further, retreating into a brittle shell of routine and discipline. Marissa responded by shrinking even more. She rose before dawn to complete chores. She learned to anticipate Dorothy's moods. She ate quietly at the corner of the kitchen table, never taking more food than she thought she deserved. She spoke softly, moved carefully, lived cautiously. The house was safe but never warm, predictable but never comforting. And though she could not articulate it then, a truth shaped her entire childhood. She had never been wanted. Not by the mother who birthed her. Not by the grandmother who raised her out of duty. Not by the world that seemed to move around her without noticing she existed. It was a beginning marked by absence, a hollow space where love should have lived. A foundation built on neglect, loss, and quiet endurance. A childhood that left Marissa believing that survival was something she had to earn, and affection was something she would never be allowed to ask for. Adolescence arrived quietly for Marissa Collins, without the bursts of curiosity or rebellion that marked other kids her age. By the time she entered her teenage years, she had already learned the consequences of wanting too much. In Dorothy Lane's house, desire was a luxury and disappointment was a certainty. So Marissa became the kind of girl who stayed small in every room she entered. Not out of shyness, but out of survival. At school, she blended into hallways like a shadow that refused to cast itself. Teachers described her as polite, well-behaved, diligent, but also distant, unreachable. Her classmates rarely remembered seeing her smile. She did her assignments, answered when called on, and kept her head down. She had no space to be loud, no permission to express herself. Years of conditional care had carved silence into her bones. But even the quietest children have places where their minds wander. For Marissa, it was the lingering, fragile hope that her biological mother, Sheila, might someday return with something resembling stability. She imagined Sheila showing up with steady eyes, a real plan, maybe even arms open wide. A mother who would say she was sorry for leaving. A mother who would claim her. Reality was nothing like the picture she carried in her imagination. Sheila appeared only when her own life collapsed, when a roommate kicked her out, when her newest boyfriend disappeared, when rent was due and excuses ran dry. She would show up at Dorothy's door wearing the same chaotic mix of perfume and cigarette smoke, smile brightly as if nothing had ever been wrong, and sweep Marissa up in grand promises. "We'll find a place together soon," she'd say. "I'm getting my life back on track. Next time, I'll take you with me." Marissa clung to those words more than she admitted, storing them like treasures even though they dissolved almost immediately. Sheila always left as quickly as she arrived, stepping back into her drifting lifestyle without looking back. Each visit reopened the wound Marissa was trying to ignore, the longing for a mother she would never truly have. Dorothy saw these visits for what they were, disruptions. She made no effort to hide her disdain. "That woman brings nothing but trouble," she would mutter as Sheila walked away. "Don't let her fill your head with nonsense." But Dorothy's warnings did nothing to ease the ache left behind. If anything, they deepened it. Marissa learned to lock her emotions away, to show nothing that could be interpreted as need. When ninth grade ended and her peers talked excitedly about applying to different high schools, Dorothy made the decision without hesitation. "You'll go to the vocational program in town," Dorothy said over breakfast, sliding a pamphlet across the table as though the matter were already settled. "It's practical. You'll learn something useful. College isn't realistic." She didn't ask what Marissa wanted, didn't consider whether the girl had dreams, talents, or interests of her own. For Dorothy, the safest path was the one she could control. Marissa didn't argue. Defiance had never been an option in Dorothy's home. Years of rigid rules and emotional austerity had taught her that resistance only led to harsher silence. So she nodded, folded the pamphlet neatly, and prepared herself for a future chosen by someone else. Other girls her age complained about curfews, pushed boundaries, tested limits. Marissa simply moved through her days on rails laid down long before she was old enough to choose a direction. Her world was defined by obedience, a form of quiet captivity she didn't know how to escape. In these years, the emotional texture of her life hardened. She became a girl who apologized when she hadn't done anything wrong, who flinched at raised voices even when they weren't meant for her, who instinctively stepped aside to make room for others. A girl who believed that wanting things, love, freedom, opportunity, was selfish. Her adolescence wasn't marked by rebellion, but by resignation. Not by exploration, but by retreat. Not by choices, but by the absence of them. And through it all, Marissa carried the quiet conviction that her life belonged to everyone but herself. Marissa entered community college without expectations. treating it the same way she approached every other stage of her life, quietly, cautiously, without allowing herself to hope for more than survival. She studied office administration, a practical choice Dorothy approved of, and kept to herself during classes, slipping in and out of lecture halls like a shadow. She had spent most of her life unseen. Invisibility felt familiar. But during her second semester, someone noticed her. His name was Ethan Collins, a warm-eyed, soft-spoken young man who held doors for classmates, remembered people's names, and smiled with genuine interest instead of politeness. He sat beside Marissa one afternoon in a computer lab, greeting her as though they had been friends for years. "You're in my Thursday class too, right?" he asked, leaning slightly toward her. Marissa nodded, startled that he had even recognized her. "I think so." Most people would have ended the conversation there. But Ethan wasn't like most people. He continued speaking with easy confidence, asking about her major, her interests, her plans. Marissa answered quietly, aware of how strange it felt to be the center of someone's attention. She waited for the moment he'd lose interest, because people always did. But Ethan didn't. He kept showing up. He sat with her before class, walked with her to the bus stop, asked if she'd eaten lunch, told her funny stories about his part-time job at a tire shop. And every time she offered short, careful replies, he responded with patience instead of frustration. It was as though he could sense how fragile her trust was, and he approached with the gentleness of someone handling something precious. Marissa struggled to understand why he cared. No one had ever chosen her before, not because they had to, not because responsibility demanded it, but because they genuinely wanted to know her. His kindness unsettled her, cracked the protective shell she had spent years building. Still, Ethan persisted, not in a forceful way, but with quiet consistency that slowly, steadily eroded her defenses. Their first date wasn't planned. One afternoon, when the campus Wi-Fi crashed and class was canceled, Ethan invited her to a nearby diner. Over burgers and milkshakes, Marissa laughed, really laughed, for the first time she could remember. Ethan watched her with soft pride, as though witnessing a sunrise. Their relationship grew the way spring does after a harsh winter, tentatively at first, then all at once. Marissa found herself waiting for his texts. Ethan learned how she liked her coffee. They walked around campus for hours, talking about dreams Marissa had never voiced aloud. By the end of their second year, Ethan proposed on a park bench overlooking the Tennessee River. It wasn't dramatic or flashy, just earnest, his voice steady, his eyes hopeful, a simple silver ring in his hand. Marissa said yes with tears she couldn't hold back, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar sensation of being loved. Their wedding was modest, almost quiet enough to go unnoticed, and Marissa preferred it that way. No celebration, no crowd, just paperwork, exchanged vows, and the feeling of stepping into a life she had never dared imagine. They settled into a small apartment in Knoxville, building a home with second-hand furniture and first-time joy. Ethan took a job as a long-haul trucker, wanting to earn enough to give them stability Marissa had never known. His schedule was demanding, but he always came home with a kiss, a story, and an unwavering devotion that filled the tiny apartment with warmth. Then came Sarah, their first daughter, whose arrival felt like sunlight breaking through years of gray. Marissa held her newborn against her chest and cried, not from fear or exhaustion, but from a happiness so unfamiliar it almost scared her. She finally understood what it meant to belong. 2 more daughters followed. Maddie, spirited and curious, and Chloe, gentle and wide-eyed. Their home became lively, messy, joyful. Dinner conversations were filled with giggles. Bedtime meant storybooks and sleepy cuddles. For the first time in her life, Marissa lived in a world shaped by love instead of survival. The shift from bleakness to warmth was subtle but profound. For someone who had grown up in emotional frost, this new life felt like spring, fragile, breathtaking, and almost too good to be real. The twins arrived on a rainy spring morning, after a difficult pregnancy that left Marissa exhausted but hopeful. When the nurses placed the boys in her arms, she felt the familiar wash of awe she had experienced with her daughters, multiplied this time, doubled in weight and wonder. She named them Noah and Eli, two tiny brothers curled against her chest, warm and fragile, their hearts beating softly beneath her fingertips. For a few days, everything felt perfect. The house was chaotic, with 3 little girls running around and 2 newborns demanding constant care. But it was a joyful chaos. Ethan beamed every time he held the boys, already planning backyard adventures and sibling traditions. Marissa watched him and felt her heart stretch in ways she hadn't known were possible. But within weeks, the quiet began to crack. Eli wasn't feeding well. He tired quickly, breathing too fast, too hard. Marissa sensed something was wrong long before the doctors confirmed it, long before anyone said the words that would shake the foundation of their lives. A severe congenital heart defect, complex, dangerous, requiring specialized surgery available only in major medical centers like Nashville or even farther. The pediatric cardiologist explained the condition in a calm, clinical tone. But Marissa heard only fragments. High risk, immediate intervention, very costly. Survival depends on surgery. She held Eli closer, trembling. The tiny boy slept in her arms, unaware of the battle waiting inside his chest. Noah cried in the stroller beside her. Sarah tugged at her sleeve, asking when they could go home. Maddie and Chloe pressed their faces against the fish tank in the waiting room. Marissa felt the world tilt. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steadying them both. "We'll figure it out," he whispered. "I'll pick up extra routes. We'll save every dollar. I promise you we'll get him the surgery." His certainty kept her breathing. Ethan had always been the unshakable one, the steady anchor in every storm. She needed to believe him, needed to believe that hard work and determination were enough to overcome something as terrifying as this. But the cost estimates were staggering. Even with Tennessee Medicaid coverage for children, the out-of-pocket expenses, travel, lodging during hospital stays, post-operative care, it was more money than they had ever imagined having to find. Still, Ethan reassured her every night, rubbing slow circles on her back, telling her they would manage it somehow. Then came the catastrophe. It was a Tuesday morning, ordinary and unremarkable. Ethan kissed her goodbye before dawn, his truck rumbling softly as it pulled away from their apartment complex. Marissa soothed a fussy Eli back to sleep, made breakfast for the girls, and packed Sarah's lunch. When the phone rang, she expected it to be Ethan checking in, maybe joking about the early traffic on I-40. Instead, a stranger's voice introduced himself from the State Highway Patrol. There had been an accident. A semi-truck ahead of Ethan had lost control on a wet curve. Ethan had tried to brake, but the momentum, the rain, the weight of his load, none of it was forgiving. His truck rolled, metal twisting against asphalt. The cab crushed before emergency responders could reach him. He died at the scene. Marissa didn't scream. She didn't drop the phone. She simply stood there, frozen, with Chloe tugging her pajama pants, asking for cereal, and Eli whimpering softly in his bassinet. Grief didn't hit all at once. It seeped in slowly, like a cold rising through the floorboards. She went through the motions, identifying the body, signing forms, calling Dorothy, arranging the funeral she could barely afford. But inside, something cracked open, a cavern of fear, sorrow, and desperate uncertainty. Now she was alone, alone with 5 children, alone with medical bills, alone with a baby whose life depended on a surgery she had no idea how to pay for. At night, when the children slept, Marissa curled around Eli and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She watched the rise and fall of his tiny chest, terrified of the moments when his breath faltered. Her grief was braided with terror, her mourning overshadowed by the brutal reality that survival, theirs and his, now rested entirely on her shoulders. The warmth that had once filled their home dissolved into something colder, sharper, and the fragile hope she and Ethan had built felt as though it had shattered overnight. The weeks that followed Ethan's death blurred into one long stretch of exhaustion and fear. Marissa moved through each day with the mechanical precision of someone too overwhelmed to think, yet too responsible to collapse. Knoxville had never felt more unforgiving. Rent was due every month without mercy. Childcare costs doubled because there was no one to help, and Eli's medications, small bottles with long, frightening names, cut deeper into her budget than groceries. Every receipt became a reminder that survival had a price she could no longer afford. She developed a routine, not because it made life easier, but because it was the only way anything functioned at all. She woke before dawn to feed the twins. She dressed the girls, walked Sarah to school holding a stroller with one hand and Maddie's and Chloe's palms with the other. Then she hurried home to clean, to soothe, to count formula cans and diapers like someone rationing the last supplies in a storm cellar. Eli's breathing was always the background sound in her mind, a soft, uneven rhythm that kept her awake even after the house fell silent. His chest worked too hard for someone so small. Every gasp felt like a countdown. She applied for Tennessee Medicaid, hoping it would cover more of Eli's specialist visits. She filled out forms for SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, stood in line for TNF, temporary assistance for needy families, met with caseworkers who spoke kindly but kept repeating the same thing. These programs can help, but they can't cover everything. The surgery remained impossibly expensive, a mountain she had no idea how to climb. A social worker encouraged her to start a fundraiser. So Marissa created an online donation page with shaky hands, attaching a picture of Eli sleeping beneath a knitted blanket. She wrote a short description because anything longer made her cry. She checked the page every night. Some days there were $5, some days 10, never enough. Hope didn't disappear suddenly. It eroded grain by grain. Friends from community college messaged condolences but offered little else. Everyone had their own bills, their own struggles. Dorothy visited once, sitting stiffly at the kitchen table, remarking that children were expensive even under the best circumstances. She never stayed long. She never held the twins. The loneliness of those months was a weight Marissa carried everywhere. She learned to ration time the way she rationed formula. Carefully, sparingly, with no room for error. She washed laundry at 2 in the morning. She skipped meals so the girls wouldn't see the pantry growing emptier. She bought diapers in the smallest pack, stretching them longer than she should have. Every decision became a calculation, but the worst moments came at night. After the children were finally asleep, Sarah curled in her blanket fort, Maddie and Chloe pressed together like matching spoons, Noah upright in his bassinet, Eli on a wedge pillow to help his breathing. Marissa sat alone at the edge of her bed. She stared at the unpaid bills on the dresser, hospital invoices, pharmacy charges, a fresh summary from the pediatric cardiology team estimating the cost of Eli's surgery, travel, lodging, and follow-up care. She folded the papers neatly, as if the order might somehow make them less terrifying. Then she cried quietly into her hands, never louder than a whisper, because the children needed her strong, because there was no one to hold her while she fell apart, because tomorrow she had to get up again and again and again, in the daylight. She was a mother of 5 holding her world together with trembling hands. A woman who refused to break because breaking wasn't an option. She smiled for her daughters, cooed at the twins, did everything she could to make their small apartment feel safe. But inside, the despair grew heavier, thick, suffocating, relentless. Marissa prayed for a miracle she didn't believe would come. And as Eli's heartbeat fluttered beneath her palm each night, she wondered how much longer she could keep hope alive when reality was crushing her inch by inch. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, at a moment when Marissa's world felt impossibly small. Eli had been fussy all morning, his breathing uneven again, and the girls were restless from being stuck indoors. She was standing at the kitchen counter sorting through another stack of bills when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. MS. Collins, a man's voice asked when she answered. My name is Benjamin Clark. I'm a probate attorney here in Nashville. I'm calling regarding the estate of Zena Mayfield. Marissa frowned, unsure she had heard him correctly. The name stirred something faint in her memory. A woman with lace collars and thinning white hair, someone she had met once at a long-ago family gathering. A distant relative on Dorothy's side, if she remembered right. She hadn't thought of the woman in years. I think there must be a mistake, Marissa said softly, shifting Eli in her arms. I barely knew her. That may be true, Mr. Clark replied gently, but Ms. Mayfield knew of you, and she named you and your children in her will. The kitchen faded around her. She pressed the phone tighter to her ear, unsure whether she had misheard again. In her will, she echoed. Yes, she passed away last month, and she left you her property in Red Hollow, Kentucky, a family home that's been in the Mayfield line for generations. Marissa leaned against the counter to steady herself. Red Hollow. She had heard Dorothy mention the town occasionally when talking about old relatives she never visited. It was rural, remote, hours from Knoxville, and she could not imagine why anyone would leave her a house there. I don't understand, she whispered. There's also a letter addressed to you, the attorney continued. Handwritten. She asked that we deliver it personally. The thought of a letter, a message from someone who had thought of her intentionally, specifically, made her throat tighten. When the attorney asked whether he could email her the scanned documents, she agreed, quietly, still stunned. The email arrived minutes later. Marissa opened the PDF on her cracked laptop. Scrolling past legal language she barely understood until she reached the section that mattered. I leave my home at 214 Willow Bend Road, Red Hollow, Kentucky, to my grandniece, Marissa Collins, and her children. Her breath caught. The home wasn't large, according to the inventory list, but it was fully paid for. No mortgage, no liens, no pending taxes beyond routine annual payments. A place she could live without draining every last cent. At the bottom of the document, a scanned image of a handwritten envelope appeared. For Marissa to be opened with hope. Zena. Her hands trembled as she clicked the next page. Zena's handwriting was neat and looping, the kind of script belonging to someone who still wrote letters instead of emails. My dear girl, I remember you from when you were small, quiet, serious, watching everything. I saw the way the world treated you, and I prayed someone would give you the safety you were never given. If life has been hard, I hope this home can be your beginning, not your ending. May you and your little ones find peace here. Zena Mayfield. Marissa covered her mouth, tears slipping past her fingers before she could stop them. The timing felt impossible, so precise, so undeserved, that she didn't know whether to cry harder or laugh in disbelief. A home, a roof she wouldn't have to pay rent for, a place to breathe, to regroup, to try again. It wasn't Knoxville. It wasn't convenient. It wasn't even practical. But it was something. And something was more than she'd had in months. That night, after the children were asleep, she spread the documents across her kitchen table. The numbers were ugly. Medical bills, rent notices, utility balances, overdue statements. Then, beside them, the scanned deed for a house she had never expected to inherit. A miracle had arrived exactly as her world was falling apart. She didn't make a dramatic decision. There was no triumphant declaration. Instead, she looked at Eli's medications lined on the counter, at the tired faces of her girls asleep on the couch, at the quiet desperation that had become her constant companion. And she understood. They would move, not because it was ideal, but because it was their only chance. The drive into Red Hollow felt longer than the map suggested. Marissa guided the aging minivan through winding back roads, past miles of forest and open fields, while the rain turned the gravel paths into thick ribbons of mud. The children grew restless, the twins fussing in their car seats, the girls alternating between curiosity and complaint. By the time the tires finally crunched onto Willow Bend Road, exhaustion had settled deep in Marissa's bones. But when the house came into view, she inhaled sharply. It sat on a small rise surrounded by tall trees, their branches forming a loose canopy that filtered the fading light. The paint was weathered, the porch boards uneven, yet the structure stood proudly, as if holding decades of stories within its walls. A narrow chimney stretched upward like an old spine, and wide windows reflected the soft gray sky. It was old, clearly old, but sturdy in a way that whispered endurance rather than decay. She parked beside the porch, unbuckled Eli and Noah, and stepped onto the creaking boards with a mixture of hope and fear. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, age, and something else, something warm. The house had been closed for months, yet it didn't feel abandoned. The front room was filled with antique furniture, a carved oak table, a rocking chair polished smooth by years of use, embroidered linens folded neatly on a wooden chest. Portraits of unfamiliar faces lined the walls, each one belonging to a chapter of the Mayfield family history. Marissa traced a finger over the mantel. "Kids, stay close," she reminded gently, though the girls were already exploring, their voices echoing down the hallway. She moved into the kitchen, setting the twins in their portable bassinets. The space was charming in an old-fashioned way. Wide counters, deep cabinets, a cast-iron stove no longer used, and shelves that held mismatched plates and mason jars. Dust coated everything, but underneath was a certain quiet warmth that wrapped around her like a hesitant embrace, determined to make the place livable before nightfall. Marissa gathered a rag and began cleaning. As she wiped down the top shelf of a worn pine cabinet, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic. A small object slid forward, a sterling silver pocket watch. She picked it up carefully, surprised by its weight. The cover was smooth, etched with delicate scrollwork that shimmered beneath the dirt. When she thumbed the clasp, the watch sprang open with a soft click, revealing hands frozen at a precise time and a face slightly yellowed with age. But it was the engraving on the inside cover that made her breath still. "To my Savior in eternal gratitude." The words were elegant, deliberate, filled with meaning she didn't understand. Who had gifted it? Who had received it? And why had it been tucked so neatly away? The silver glinted even in the dim light, and Marissa felt a tug in her chest. Something this old and finely crafted had to be worth money. Maybe a lot of money. Enough to cover part of Eli's surgery? Enough to give them a chance? For a moment, hope surged, but she pushed it down. She knew nothing about antiques. She didn't know its value, or if selling it was even the right thing to do. But the thought lodged itself in her mind, stubborn and bright. As she stood there turning the watch in her hands, a soft shiver traveled down her spine. The air felt different, charged, as though someone had just walked through the room. Marissa glanced behind her. Nothing. Yet Eli, lying in his bassinet, stared intensely at the far corner of the kitchen, his small chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Noah did the same, their tiny eyes fixed on a place where nothing visible stood. Marissa swallowed, suddenly aware of the house's silence, of its age, of the generations that had lived and died within its walls. But the sensation wasn't frightening, just strange. Like the whisper of a presence, too gentle to unsettle, she exhaled slowly, brushing a thumb over the inscription again. This house had been entrusted to her. This watch had been left behind. And somewhere beneath the dust and stillness, she sensed a story waiting to be uncovered. The house was silent when the knocking began. Marissa woke with a start, her heart hammering as she pushed herself upright on the old sofa where she had finally drifted off. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the lace curtains. She listened, breath held tight in her chest. A second round of knocks echoed through the house. Loud, insistent, almost desperate. For a moment, fear rooted her in place. They were miles from town, surrounded by forest and empty fields. No neighbors nearby. No reason for anyone to come this late. But then she heard nothing. No movement from the children's bedroom. No startled cries. No shifting from the twins. They slept as peacefully as if the house had been silent all along. Marissa stood slowly, pulling her sweater tight around her as she crossed the creaking floorboards. The knocking came again, gentler this time, as though whoever stood outside had grown tired or patient. Her hand trembled when she unlocked the door. When she pulled it open, cold night air rushed in, along with the sight of an elderly man standing on the porch. He was thin, almost fragile, with a posture softened by time. His gray hair hung in wisps beneath a worn hat, and deep lines traced his face like rivers etched by decades of weather. But his eyes, clear, steady, strangely familiar, met hers with warmth rather than threat. "Evening, Miss Collins," he said kindly, as though greeting someone he had known for years. "I hope I didn't scare you none." Marissa swallowed. I'm sorry, but do I know you?" The old man smiled, slow, gentle smile that softened every edge of his face. "Name's Isaiah Mayfield," he said. "This here was my family's home long before your great-aunt Zena got to tending it. Thought I'd stop by, see how you and the little ones were settling in." Isaiah Mayfield. The name struck her like a soft blow. It was one she recognized from the photo album upstairs, the sepia photograph labeled Isaiah Mayfield, 1973. A man whose eyes looked uncannily similar to the ones staring at her now. But that was impossible. The photo was decades old. Dorothy had mentioned he'd been gone a long, long time. Yet the man on her porch stood solid and breathing, dusted with moonlight, waiting patiently for her to invite him in. For reasons she couldn't explain, Marissa stepped aside. "Come in," she whispered. Isaiah removed his hat, wiping his boots politely before crossing the threshold. The moment he entered, the house felt warmer, as though recognizing him. He glanced around with affectionate familiarity. "Zena took real good care of this place," he said. "She had a soft heart, even if she didn't show it much. Shame she didn't get to see you grow up." Marissa motioned toward the kitchen. "Would you like some tea?" "I'd be mighty grateful," he said, settling into a chair at the old wooden table. She boiled water on the stovetop while he watched with quiet interest, his hands resting neatly in his lap. When she placed the tea in front of him, he wrapped his fingers around the mug like someone savoring a memory. "You found the watch, didn't you?" he asked softly. Marissa froze. "Yes, I did." Isaiah nodded, his gaze gentle. "That silver piece has traveled a long way. Belonged to a man who near lost his little girl to the river's current back in '49. I pulled her out just in time. And her daddy gave me that watch with tears in his eyes, said it was for a savior. But I never thought of myself as one." He chuckled, quietly, looking down at the table. "Thing is," he continued, "gifts like that don't stay with us forever. They move where they're needed. That watch wasn't meant to gather dust in a drawer. It was meant to save another innocent life someday." Marissa felt her throat tighten. She said nothing, afraid her voice might break the fragile calm that filled the room. Isaiah went on, telling stories of the Mayfield family, of corn harvests and winter storms, of weddings in the backyard and laughter echoing through these very walls. His words flowed like warm honey, soothing her in a way she had never expected. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, the house settling around them. Somewhere between the tales of Old Red Hollow and the soft hum of Isaiah's voice, Marissa's eyelids grew heavy. The exhaustion of the past months wrapped around her, gentle and irresistible. She felt the chair beneath her, the warmth of the room, the comfort of being spoken to with kindness. Her head drooped, her breathing slowed. The last thing she heard was Isaiah murmuring, "Rest, Miss Collins. You're safe here." When she finally drifted into sleep, it was with a strange sense of peace, one she hadn't felt in years. Sunlight was already filtering through the curtains when Marissa woke, her neck stiff from sleeping upright at the kitchen table. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The room felt strangely warm, almost comforted, as if someone had tucked a blanket around the whole house while she slept. Then she remembered. The knocking, the man, the voice, the stories. She sat up abruptly, breath shallow, eyes darting to the opposite chair. Empty. Only one cup of tea sat there, hers half-finished, cooling in the morning air. Across from it, the second mug remained exactly where she had placed it last night. The steam was long gone, but the cup itself had never been touched, not even moved an inch. Marissa's pulse quickened. Had she imagined it? Had exhaustion created an entire conversation? She stood slowly, listening for the children. The girls were still asleep in their shared room. The twins breathed softly, undisturbed. The house was perfectly quiet, normal in a way that made last night feel unreal. But she needed to see for herself. Marissa stepped out onto the porch. Cool morning air brushed her face, and the smell of damp earth filled her lungs. The rain had softened the dirt road into dark, thick mud. Her eyes swept the path, from the front steps to the bend in the trees. No footprints, no tire marks, no sign anyone had approached the house at all. A shiver traced her spine. She stepped back inside, closing the door carefully, the old latch clicking into place. Logic struggled against memory, his gentle voice, the way he spoke of the house, the watch, the family. She could still recall the sound of his chair scraping softly against the floor. But the evidence said otherwise, driven by a need for something, anything, to make sense of the night. Marissa climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew cooler as she reached the top, dust motes spinning through sunbeams like tiny, drifting stars. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled in careful handwriting. She knelt before the largest one, Mayfield family, photos. Inside lay dozens of albums, their leather covers cracked with age. She lifted the first one, gently, then opened it across her lap. Old photographs filled the pages, sepia portraits of stern men and soft-faced women, black and white snapshots of farmhands' riverbanks, church gatherings. She flipped slowly, her fingertips tracing the curled edges. Halfway through the second album, her hand froze. There he was, a photograph labeled in faded ink, Isaiah Mayfield, 1973. The man in the picture was unmistakable. Frail frame, kind eyes, that same gentle warmth in his expression. The same features she had seen sitting at her kitchen table just hours earlier. Marissa's breath hitched. Her heart pounded with a mix of awe and something close to fear, but not fear of him. Fear of what it meant. She closed the album slowly, her fingers trembling. A knock startled her. This time it was soft, polite, nothing like the insistent pounding from the night before. Marissa hurried downstairs and opened the door to find a woman in her late 60s standing on the porch, holding a freshly baked pie. "Well, good morning," the woman said warmly. "You must be Marissa. I'm Evelyn Carter, your neighbor down the road." Marissa managed a smile, still shaken. "Hello, yes. I'm Marissa. I thought I'd bring you a little welcome-to-town treat," Mrs. Carter said, handing her the pie. "Saw the moving truck yesterday. Figured you might not have had time to bake." Her eyes softened as she glanced past Marissa into the house. "This place holds a lot of history," she added, "especially the Mayfield family. Shame about that old silver watch going missing after Zena passed. Folks still talk about it." Marissa's grip tightened around the pie tin. The watch?" she asked carefully. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Carter nodded. "Isaiah's watch. Beautiful piece. He got it back in the 40s after saving that landowner's daughter. Such a story, that one." She chuckled. "But, of course, Isaiah's been gone for decades now. I was just a girl when he passed." Marissa felt the floor tilt beneath her. Decades. Gone for decades. Yet she had spoken to him last night. Mrs. Carter chatted a bit longer before heading home. Unaware of the storm she had stirred in Marissa's mind. When the door closed, Marissa leaned against it, clutching the pie, her heart thudding softly. She thought of the untouched tea, the trackless road, the photo in the album, and the silver watch waiting in the kitchen drawer. It had come to her for a reason, just as he had. Mrs. Carter returned the following afternoon with a basket of preserves and the easy warmth of someone who had spent her whole life in a town where neighbors mattered. Marissa invited her inside, still unsure how much of the previous night she should share. It felt too delicate, too otherworldly, to speak aloud just yet. But as they settled at the kitchen table, sunlight pooling across the worn wood, Mrs. Carter began talking about the Mayfields without prompting, about their long history in Red Hollow, their generosity, their stubborn streaks, their tragedies and triumphs. Her voice carried the gentle cadence of storytelling passed down through generations. "You know," Mrs. Carter said, reaching for her cup, "there are a few legends around this house, especially about Isaiah." Marissa's pulse jumped. "Legends?" "Oh, yes," the older woman chuckled. "People around here say he never really stopped watching over the family. Kind soul, that man. Never wanted anyone to feel unsafe under this roof." Marissa stared at her, breath caught in her throat. I think I might have felt that," she whispered. Mrs. Carter smiled knowingly, then reached into her tote bag and pulled out an old clipping from a local historical newsletter. "Thought you'd want this. Story about that silver watch of his." The words "silver watch" seemed to fill the room. Marissa unfolded the paper carefully. The article described an incident from the 1940s, a wealthy landowner's daughter falling into the river during a summer picnic, Isaiah diving in after her without hesitation, nearly losing his own life to the current. The father, overwhelmed with gratitude, presented him with a handcrafted sterling silver pocket watch, engraved with the same inscription Marissa had seen. "To my Savior in eternal gratitude." It was priceless even back then, Mrs. Carter said softly. Not just emotionally. Monetary, too. A piece like that, sterling silver, custom engraving, craftsmanship from that era. It's worth a small fortune today. Maybe more. Marissa's voice wavered. More? How much more? "Well," Mrs. Carter said, leaning back thoughtfully, "a serious antique dealer, one who understands what this watch is, might pay enough to put a child through college. Or cover something important." Something important. Eli's surgery. The room shifted into sharp focus. The bills she had agonized over. The nights she had cried quietly so the children wouldn't hear. The hopelessness that had buried her for months. All of it collided with one truth. The watch was the miracle. Isaiah had come not to frighten her, not even to comfort her, but to guide her toward the very thing he once promised, a saving. Marissa exhaled a long, trembling breath she had held inside herself for too long. Mrs. Carter reached across the table and touched her hand. "Sometimes, honey, things find their way to the people who need them most." When the older woman left, Marissa stood in the center of the kitchen, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The watch lay in the drawer beside her, wrapped gently in a cloth, waiting. She walked to the window. Outside, the land shimmered under the afternoon sun, the trees swaying softly, the porch casting its long shadow across the yard. This place had been entrusted to her, not just the house, but its memories, its stories, its guardians. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure whether she was speaking to the walls, the land, or the spirit of the man who had saved a little girl so many decades ago. She retrieved the watch, holding it carefully, reverently. It gleamed as though polished by unseen hands. She traced the inscription with her thumb and felt something shift inside her. Something warm, steady, quietly fierce. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope she had clung to in Knoxville, but a deeper one, a real one. She knew what she had to do. Tomorrow, she would contact an antique appraiser in Louisville, a reputable dealer who specialized in heirlooms of significant historic value. She would take the watch, secure the funds, and schedule Eli's surgery. For the first time in months, the future didn't look impossible. That night, after the children fell asleep, Marissa stepped onto the porch. The moon hung low between the trees, silver and soft. She felt a presence, not frightening, not even visible, but reassuring, as if someone stood quietly nearby. "Thank you." "Isaiah," she whispered into the cool air. No wind answered. No voice replied. But the house seemed to settle around her, peaceful and protective, as though acknowledging her gratitude. The ending was not victory, not yet. But it was hope, quiet, steady, and finally within reach. And for the first time in years, Marissa allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday.